Let's just take you through some of the evidence that we saw offered in court today. We know that Jan Botha, a pathologist for the defence, appeared today. He has been on the stand throughout the morning, and it began, of course, with Barry Rue taking him through some of the most important points in his examination from a pathological point of view. Let's start with the first one: gastric emptying. This has been has come into rather more usage today than before in the trial, and Botha here describing the study of gastric emptying as highly controversial and inexact science. He says meals being broken up into three broad categories: light, medium or heavy, but there's no strict definition of any of these. We know this is relevant because it refers to Riva Steenkamp's last meal and how long she actually had that meal before she died. Botha warning that all books talk about the variations in gastric emptying from person to person, even in the same person, depending on issues like what medication the person may have taken, what sort of stress they were under psychologically, what type of meal they ate. And he goes on to say one cannot be adamant about something that is in the realms of speculation. And that is a clear reference, of course, to Gert Simon, the state pathologist's argument here that Riva Steenkamp could have eaten roughly 2 hours before her death at around 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, moving on to Steenkamp's wounds here, this ended up being a very controversial point a little later on during cross-examination. But Botha emphasized that based on the position of the bullet holes in the door and the location of the gunshot wounds to Steenkamp's body, he says in all probability that first shot was fired into her right hip fairly close to the door. In that instance, he coheres with Chris Mangena, state ballistics expert's view. With the injury to the right hip bone, he says the right hip joint would have become totally unstable. It would have caused Riva to fall. He then goes on to say the second shot would have struck her over her right arm. He described this later as a traumatic amputation. Now, these secondary wounds also suggest, he says, that she was quite close to the door. He thinks the third shot injured her left hand and ricocheted through into the left wall. So he says this bullet went into the web between the fingers of her left hand. And then he describes how he believes she fell to the left of the magazine rack. He says the last shot was to her head, which also coheres with what the state has asserted. But he is disputing Chris Mangena's evidence that she fell onto the magazine rack after the second shot. In terms of ricochet marks, now these were two marks in Steenkamp's back described as parallel striations, and we saw a photograph of that just a short while ago. Botha believing that the black talon bullets that Oscar Pistorius fired would not have caused these lesions. He's confident that the marks were from the scallop of the magazine rack, so from the edge of the magazine rack, he says, and they were created by her sliding along that and her back making contact with the rack as she slid down. The results of the wounding, very interesting. He believes after the first shot, her movements would have been of an involuntary nature, so they would have been unconscious. She wouldn't have been consciously moving her body to achieve these particular stances or positions. But he's unclear on how much pain Steenkamp felt. He says there was probably shock. He agrees the right lower arm would have been completely non-functional. An injury to the head, he agrees, would have rendered her totally incapacitated. But he believes death ensued fairly quickly after the head injury. And he says if shots were fired in rapid sequence, it's highly unlikely she would have been able to cry out. He says those shots could have been fired within a period of 4 seconds. So before she had time to respond, he believes she would have been incapacitated. Now, discussions then centered around the urine content. The Gert Simon report stating that there was about 1 teaspoon of urine remaining in her bladder. Botha saying this probably points to the fact that she may have voided her bladder very shortly before she died. This was when things became a little bit heated because we moved on to a cross-examination by Gerrie Nel, and we've seen a far more tenacious, a far more aggressive Gerrie Nel in court today. He focused first on Botha's use of the reports, Botha admitting he disregarded Reggie Perumal's report. Now remember, Reggie Perumal is the pathologist for the defense, and he was actually present during the during Gert Simon's examination of Riva Steenkamp's body. Then Botha going on to say he did not work from Reggie Perumal's report. He preferred to work from Gert Simon's report because it was a more detailed one. quite a heated argument over the angle of the bullet. Botha says Steenkamp was in a flexed position when she was shot in the hip. Nel says Reeva was upright. Now, we saw the introduction of this term, collar of abrasion, being used to describe the angle of the bullet. Nel insists that this angling on the hip was caused by the bullet passing through the door. Nel saying, I challenge you to Botha. I challenge you to bring me any evidence to the effect that the trajectory of an object passing through a door is not altered by the very presence of that door. Botha coming back to say, well, the textbooks don't really deal with that issue. And then we have this issue of gastric emptying once again. Nel saying to Botha, you say, Simon, the state pathologist is wrong in his calculation of the time of Reeva's last meal. Botha saying, no, I'm not saying that. Nel retorting, you say you don't know, so Simon could well be right. The sequence of shots once again, and perhaps Botha found himself in an extremely difficult position here, having given evidence on an area that many would say was not actually his strong point. They differed in the sequence of shots to the issue of the third and fourth bullet. Nel confirming, in line with Mangena's testimony, that the first shot in the hip would have resulted in Reeva falling backwards. Nel then asking, how did the second bullet hit her in the arm if you agree she fell back after being hit in the hip? Botha then saying he's not in a position to predict the exact sequence of shots. I'm not a ballistician, he says, I'm a pathologist. And then a duel began over the sequence of shots. Botha asserting that shooting is a dynamic set of events. Nobody knows for certain exactly what position the body would have been in. And Nel then asking him, why are you giving an opinion on the sequence of shots if you are not a ballistics expert? The tissue evidence then came up, and we saw some very graphic pictures at this point of body tissue, of brain matter, highly magnified pictures of torn strands of hair on the toilet bowl and of blood spatter on the wall. Nel asserting that there was brain tissue in the toilet, suggesting Reeva's head must have been at the height of the toilet when that final shot was fired. And of course, just ending off with the issue of striations, Nel describing the striations in Reeva's back. We also saw a picture of this as a railway line, and he was questioning Botha's assertions that these marks actually came from the magazine rack, asking if that was, having a look at that picture and seeing fine hairs apparent in that picture, isn't it likely that the hair would be removed if there were striations? And after much persuasion, Botha agrees that it is likely that the hair would have been removed by such a thing. So some very technical evidence in court today, some very clinical presentation of really what were the last agonizing moments of Reeva Steenkamp's life. This testimony, of course, continues after the court adjournment. Jan Botha remains on the stand as the pathologist for the defense, and of course Gerrie Nel will continue his cross-examination after this break. We're taking a short break now. We'll be back with more in just a while.
Know more about your world.
eNCA.com.